Hi everyone, my name is Emily Dolson, and I'm an assistant professor at Michigan State University, and I'm really excited to be here talking to you today about artificial ecologies. So artificial ecologies are really kind of a broad cross-cutting theme within artificial life. They touch on a lot of different facets of it, and I kind of made this one of the topics of the summer school as a way to sneak in a bunch of different subfields of A-life. So to understand what artificial ecologies are, we should start out by understanding what non-artificial ecology is. According to dictionary.com, ecology is the branch of biology that deals with organisms' relations to each other and possibly their physical surroundings. So fundamentally, ecology is all about interactions. And in biology, there's kind of a split between ecosystem ecologists, who focus on the interactions between organisms and their abiotic environment, and community ecologists, who focus on the interactions between organisms and other organisms. So ecosystem ecologists tend to be really focused on nutrient cycling, like the nitrogen cycle or the carbon cycle, whereas community ecologists tend to be focused on things like competition, predation, food webs, mutualism, all those kind of interactions between different types of organisms that could exist. And in principle, we could have both of these types of ecology in artificial life, and to some extent we do. But at this point, I would say that in general, there's a pretty strong emphasis on community ecology over ecosystem ecology, possibly just because kind of the interactions between types of species feel more like they might generalize. Okay, so that's what ecology is in biology. What is ecology in artificial life? Well, it's mostly the same thing. The big difference is that either the species or genotypes or phenotypes or whatever is composing the ecological community are generally something artificial, or else the community itself is something that has been artificially constructed. And the reason that ecology is really important in artificial life is that ecological interactions are one of the big things that make biological systems act in ways that we think of as lifelike. And so when we try to think about instantiating lifelike systems outside of traditional biology, a lot of the kind of dynamics and behaviors that we're most interested in seeing are the ones that are associated with ecology. This is similar to the reason that evolution is so commonly studied in artificial life. These are two of the main organizing processes behind collections of living things. Okay, so why do we study ecology in artificial life? Well, there are a few reasons. One of the biggest ones is to be able to better understand or even predict what will happen in ecological communities in nature or in other biological contexts. These can often be very challenging problems to untangle in nature or even in the lab, because measuring the interactions between different types of individuals can be very challenging and sometimes even impossible. And so having artificial systems to do it in is a very powerful tool for biologists that are seeking to better understand these dynamics and how they apply to biology. On the flip side, there's also a line of research in artificial ecologies that's focused on using artificial life as a tool to create ecologies that do things that we want them to. And often the big challenge here is being able to make ecologies that are stable enough that they will continue doing whatever thing we design them to do. There are a lot of ecological communities in nature that we as humans rely on. And so working on how to create stable versions of those that will do the same things that we need can be really valuable. And on top of that, we can potentially build new ecological communities that will do even more useful things for us, perhaps above and beyond what we can do by engineering a specific species. And the other reason that we study ecology a lot in artificial life is that a lot of people who are studying A-life are interested in understanding complex systems in general. And ecological interactions are kind of one of the fundamental dynamics that can make a system behave in a complex way, where there's a lot of constituent parts that we could understand. We can understand how they interact with each other, but the overarching behavior of the system can still be hard to predict because of the nonlinear interactions between the individuals or just unexpected emergent effects of the simple rules that govern the interactions between these individuals. So it's a very fertile ground for complexity theory as well. Okay, so now that we've talked about what artificial ecologies are and why you might care and how you might study them, let's talk about some specific examples of research on artificial ecologies that have happened in the A-life community so far. So, like I said, this kind of spans all facets of A-life. So I'm going to walk through the soft, hard, and wet subsets of A-life. And let's start with soft. When we think about soft artificial life, so, artificial life that takes place in a computer, we can often think about the systems that we might study it in as falling along a sort of continuum, where on one extreme, we've got relatively simple and very targeted systems. And by targeted, I mean they're usually targeted very much at a specific question. Or in the case of ecology, they're often targeted at actually a specific ecosystem in nature that they're being used to try to understand. And at the other extreme, we've got very complex systems. And these systems tend to be used not to understand, this population of fish in this river, but instead to get at kind of general questions about, hey, what happens if you have two populations that are competing with each other and they've got some of these characteristics? And both of these are very valuable, and both of them are part of artificial life. The group of people that are studying kind of the systems on the simpler end tend to kind of exist at an intersection between artificial life and standard ecological modeling. You could make an argument that actually most ecological modeling could be considered a form of artificial life, but most of those people don't think of themselves as studying artificial life. But regardless, there's plenty of artificial life done on these more targeted systems. As we move up to the more complex systems, there's also been a lot done. Although, interestingly, it's pretty much all been in the context of evolution. And that doesn't need to be true. I personally study ecoevolutionary dynamics, so I certainly like mixing ecology and evolution. But there's also a lot of fruitful questions that we could be asking about pure ecology. But regardless, in these more complex artificial life systems, we've addressed questions such as, how do ecological communities emerge? What pressures are sufficient to produce them? And what are the effects of having certain kinds of ecological communities? Do they facilitate evolution in certain directions or other behaviors? And these systems have included all kinds of ecological dynamics: predator-prey, mutualism, parasitism, competition. Really, the biggest challenge with studying a lot of these systems starts to be how complex they are. That at some point, it's not even that much better than trying to study nature, because there's just so much to untangle. And there are obviously still benefits to trying to untangle that in a digital system, because it is much more possible to make certain measurements and ask certain questions. But it still exists along the same continuum of trade-offs. Moving on from soft A-life to hard A-life, this is probably the subset of A-life with the least ecology, but it's not zero. Hard A-life, again, is robotics, basically. And there's actually been some really cool work done on robots that are kind of like hybrids between plants and machines. A particularly notable instance of this was the Flora Robotica project, where they were basically using robots to control where and how much plants grew by providing, for instance, light of different colors to very specific parts of different plants. And the idea is that you could use this to build kind of self-restoring walls, and all kinds of useful living architecture. And you could argue a bit about whether that counts as ecology, because it's technically just the plant. But I would say that in the same way that ecology can be interactions between organisms and their abiotic environment, I think in this case, regardless of whether you want to consider the robots part of the abiotic environment or another species that the plant is interacting with, I think we can call it ecology. And so this is a clear example of a situation where the goal is to use ecology to build something that is useful to us. And then lastly, we have wet A-life. This is probably the subset of A-life where artificial ecologies have been explored the most. So there's a whole field of synthetic ecology that overlaps pretty heavily with A-life. And there's a lot of different things going on in that field. So at one extreme, you've got ecologies of synthetic organisms. For instance, you could create a set of different types of protocells that all interact in a certain way, and that would be an artificial ecology. On the other extreme, you could just bring together a bunch of bacteria that would not usually live together, and that would also be an artificial ecology. Another completely different take on a wet artificial ecology is the idea of chemical ecologies. And so this is the idea that if you've got a bunch of chemicals in a soup together, they actually are in some sense forming an ecology, because based on the network of reactions that the chemicals can do with each other, certain chemicals will help facilitate the continued presence of other chemicals. And you start to get all of the same interactions that you get in ecology. Lastly, and I know this isn't one of the 3 official areas of A-Life, but it's really cool, so I want to make sure to point it out, is speculative ecology. So art is explicitly a really important part of the field of artificial life, both because lifelike systems are this inherently beautiful thing that can be really powerfully channeled into art, but also because art can be a really powerful medium for kind of imagining how life could be, and what other kinds of lifelike systems could exist. And these artistic renderings can be a really powerful tool for thinking about future directions for the science side of artificial life to go in. And I think one great example of this is Rachel Armstrong's work. She did a keynote a few years ago at A-Life, I think in Newcastle. And she had this gorgeous project called Future Venice, which was basically an imagining of what the city of Venice could look like in the future if we were to build a synthetic ecology to help fix some of its problems. And so 2 of the big problems that are facing Venice are the canals are very polluted, and also the canals are kind of wearing away some of the foundations of the cities. And so this art project was kind of multifaceted. First, it included some kind of synthetically engineered protocells that actually existed that would take some of the contaminants and the pollutants in the water out and turn them into these cool looking kind of crystalline structures. And then the other component was this purely speculative piece that imagined what would happen if you were to kind of put those protocells into the canals and build them into some sort of stable, self-perpetuating ecosystem where they could continue to exist. And the thought was perhaps this ecosystem could be constructed such that the kind of crystalline structures that they formed would actually reinforce the foundations of the buildings. And obviously there's a ton of science that needs to go into actually figuring out how to do that. But these kind of artistic renderings of what that could look like are a beautiful example of kind of the power of speculative artificial ecology for helping us just think about what the possibilities even are for the science that we could do. There is tons more cool artificial ecology, but I don't want to go over time. So thank you so much, and please feel free to ask any questions that you have.